170,000 men served in this unit. 62,000 never walked out. Their own army gave them a nickname before they'd even fired a shot, the Suicide Club, not because they were reckless, because everyone already knew the math. If you sat behind a machine gun in World War I, you weren't the most feared man on the battlefield. You were the most hunted. Artillery zeroed in on your position first. Snipers waited for you specifically. Entire squads were trained with one single job: find you and kill you before you kill them. And if you somehow made it out alive, you didn't come home a hero. You came home replaying every single night the exact moment hundreds of men fell in front of your barrel, knowing you were the one who pulled the trigger. This is the true story of the deadliest weapon of the Great War, and the men who paid for it with their minds long after the guns went silent. If stories like this hit different, the human cost the history books never show you, hit subscribe right now, because the War Files uncovers this every single week, and you do not want to miss what's coming next. Alright, let's go back to where this nightmare actually started. Long before machines did the killing, men did it one shot at a time. Muskets, muzzle loaders. Reload, aim, fire, reload again. The first real attempt to speed that up was the Volley gun, a cluster of barrels bolted together, all fired at once. Impressive for about 3 seconds, then completely useless while you reloaded the whole rig by hand. Then came Richard Gatling. His hand-cranked, multi-barrel monster wasn't quite a true machine gun. It was closer to a rifle that reloaded itself as you turned a handle. But it hinted at something terrifying: one man, doing the work of dozens. Armies were slow to trust it. It was bulky, mounted like a small cannon, and impossible to drag alongside marching infantry. It looked like the future, but it moved like the past. The real leap came from a man named Hiram Maxim, and what he figured out changed warfare forever. Maxim noticed something everyone else had ignored: every time a gun fires, it kicks back with real force. Instead of wasting that punch, why not let the gun use its own recoil to reload itself? No crank, no muscle, just pull the trigger and hold it. The weapon would eject the spent shell, chamber a fresh round, and fire again all on its own, faster than any human hand could manage. Between 1883 and 1885, Maxim locked down patents on every method of making this work. Gas-powered, recoil-powered blowback, so no rival could copy him. And here's the part that should stop you cold: he built a working prototype in 1884, a full year before smokeless gunpowder even existed. He was taming filthy smoke-choked black powder cartridges and still getting his gun to fire reliably, cycle after cycle, over 200 arrows and test rounds deep with barely a hiccup. The dial on his gun could be set anywhere from a single shot a minute to 600 rounds per minute, like a throttle for death itself. When the military ran trials, the math was almost unbelievable. One Maxim gun matched the output of 60 riflemen firing together. 60 men replaced by one weapon and one operator. And unlike Gatling's clunky gravity, fed ammo hoppers that jammed constantly. Maxim fed his gun from long fabric belts. 250 rounds at a stretch, linkable end-to-end for as long as you had ammo. For the first time, a gun could just keep firing. But constant firing means constant heat, and heat destroys barrels. So Maxim wrapped his barrel in a water-filled steel jacket, nearly a gallon of water boiling away the heat, condensing back down through a tube so steam wouldn't give away the gun's position. Fed properly, this thing could fire for hours. The whole rig, gun, tripod, water, weighed around 117 pounds, and it usually took a crew of 4 to 6 men to keep it running: someone firing, someone feeding the belt, others hauling ammunition, water, and spare parts. There was even a scaled-up version firing 37 Bowman shells that the British turned down flat. The Boers in South Africa didn't. They bought it, nicknamed it the Pom-Pom, and later used Britain's own invention to devastate British artillery crews in their own war. Poetic and brutal. At first, the top brass everywhere dismissed Maxim's gun. Too expensive. Too much ammunition burned. Nobody could picture how it would actually be used in a real war. That skepticism was about to get demolished in the most horrifying way imaginable. 3 nations built their own versions of Maxim's design, and each one would leave a scar on history. Germany fielded the MG08. Britain built the Vickers, a gun so dependable it became legend. In one single engagement, a Vickers crew fired for 12 straight hours, burning through nearly 1 million rounds across 100 barrels without a single failure. That gun stayed in British service until 1968, retired with a full military funeral, like a soldier. Russia built its own Maxim variant mounted on a wheeled cart, and unbelievably, versions of it are still spotted in combat today, in the war in Ukraine. France went a different direction entirely with the air-cooled Hotchkiss, built for a desert war where hauling gallons of water simply wasn't realistic. Its thick, ringed barrel could glow dark red at 400 degrees Celsius and keep firing. American troops even borrowed the Hotchkiss when they first joined the fight, before rolling out their own designs. But before any of these guns ever fired at a European enemy, they were tested, brutally, on people who couldn't fight back. In colonial campaigns in Africa, Just a few hundred British colonial troops carrying 5 Maxim guns faced down thousands of Matabele warriors in a surprise night attack. The guns didn't just repel the assault, they annihilated it. Roughly 1,500 warriors were killed. The British lost 4 men. A week later, thousands more attacked again, and thousands more fell to the same guns. You'd think a slaughter like that would have screamed a warning to every general in Europe. It didn't. They shrugged it off, told themselves that only happened to less developed forces, that civilized European warfare would surely play out differently. Even the brutal lessons of the Russo-Japanese War got ignored. They were about to find out how wrong they were, and millions of young men were about to die paying for that arrogance. When war exploded across Europe in August 1914, generals on every side promised their troops they'd be home by Christmas. They still believed in bold offensives, sweeping cavalry charges, and victory through sheer willpower. What they didn't understand, what nobody wanted to understand, was that defensive weapons had leapt decades ahead of offensive tactics. Picture this: rows of soldiers advancing shoulder to shoulder across open ground, exactly like a Napoleonic battle 100 years earlier. Now put a machine gun crew on the other side of that field. That's not a battle, that's an execution. Within the first 2 months of the war, the combined armies of Europe suffered over 3 million casualties. 3 million in 60 days. The quick war evaporated almost instantly. Britain entered the fight with just 2 Vickers guns per battalion. Germany fielded roughly 6 per regiment. By the war's final year, Germany had scaled up to 1 machine gun for every 50 soldiers, and Britain had multiplied its firepower 18 times over. After staggering losses at the Marne, German forces dug into high ground and refused to move. Both sides then tried desperately to outflank each other northward in what's remembered as the race to the sea. Though it was really a chain of failed attacks, each one pushing the front line further toward the coast. By the end of November 1914, an unbroken scar of trenches stretched from the Alps all the way to the North Sea. Roughly 25,000 miles of trench line dug over the course of the war. In some stretches, more than 30 machine guns were packed into a single kilometer of front. Machine guns had made offense nearly suicidal and defense nearly unbreakable. That's exactly why this became a war of trenches, mud, and stalemate, and not a war of movement like everyone had planned. So how did this actually play out on the ground? Machine gun nests were dug in roughly every 250 yards along the front, each angled to cover the next one's blind spots. A web of interlocking death. In front of them, rows of barbed wire cleared killing ground, and if the crew was lucky, a concrete bunker for cover. When a machine gun fired in long bursts, the bullets didn't fly in a perfectly straight line. Vibration and wind scattered them into a cone-shaped pattern that stretched into what soldiers called the beaten zone, a lethal oval roughly 2 meters wide. Out to 600 meters, that stream of bullets stayed almost perfectly level with a standing man's head the entire distance. Anyone upright in that path was hit. String several guns together with overlapping fields of fire, and you could deny an entire stretch of battlefield, sometimes 2 miles wide, to anyone trying to cross it. Knock out one gun, and the ones beside it simply covered the gap. Machine gunners also mastered something called enfilade fire, shooting down the length of an enemy line instead of straight into its front, meaning a single bullet could pass through multiple soldiers standing single file. Barbed wire belts stretching 15 meters deep were strung out at night specifically to slow men down and trap them longer in the kill zone. And when the rain came, the churned, shell-blasted ground turned into mud deep enough to genuinely drown a man who got stuck in it. Artillery gets a lot of the credit for the carnage of the Western Front, and it caused the majority of it, somewhere around 60 to 70% of all casualties. But machine guns weren't far behind, responsible for an estimated 20 to 40% of all deaths in battle. Now imagine actually living behind one of these guns. The gunner aimed and fired. A loader crouched beside him, feeding the belt. More men hauled ammunition boxes, water cans, and spare parts back and forth under fire. When the water ran dry, crews resorted to relieving themselves into the jacket, just to keep the gun cool and running. Barrels needed swapping roughly every hour of sustained fire, and every single stoppage, every jam, every misfeed, had to be cleared in seconds, because every second the gun sat silent was a second the enemy used to close the distance. Machine gun crews were the single most hunted target on any battlefield. Artillery zeroed in on their positions before an attack even began. Snipers hunted specifically for gunners. Entire infantry tactics, and eventually entire specialized units, were built around one mission: destroying machine gun nests. Grenadiers crept toward them from the sides and rear. The British literally invented the tank to smash through barbed wire and roll straight over these guns. Britain's machine gun corps earned a nickname that says everything you need to know: the Suicide Club. Out of roughly 170,000 men who served in it, 62,000 became casualties. These crews were often stationed ahead of the main front line as a deliberate defensive tactic, which meant they were exposed to nearly everything the enemy could throw at them. New replacements took over positions knowing full well their predecessor had just died in that exact spot. And knowing the odds hadn't improved for them either. Now picture the moment an attack begins. A gunner opens fire and does not stop, cannot stop, until he's hit. The instant he goes down, the next man in the crew grabs the gun and keeps firing, because he already knows this moment was coming for him too. And he knows someone will likely take his place minutes later. Even the men who survived had to carry something almost unspeakable. They had personally cut down hundreds of advancing soldiers. Watched them fall in real time, and there was no room to process any of it in the moment. That processing came later, in nightmares, in silence, in a version of what we'd now call PTSD, for men who had no name for what they were living through, and no support waiting for them when they came home. Since machine guns were nearly useless on the attack, armies spent the whole war hunting for a way to make them mobile. Germany tried trimming down the MG-08 into a lighter version with a shoulder stock and bipod. Better, but still not the breakthrough they needed. Then Colonel Isaac Newton Lewis introduced something genuinely newsy. An air-cooled gun with a distinctive barrel shroud that pulled cool air across the metal after every shot, eliminating the need for a heavy water jacket entirely. At around 28 pounds, a quarter the weight of the water-cooled giants, fed by a top-mounted drum magazine, this was one of the first machine guns a single soldier could actually carry and fire on the move, opening the door to entirely new offensive tactics. Other attempts were far less successful. France's Chochet became infamous for its half-open magazine that let mud pour straight into the mechanism, causing the vast majority of its jams. Under battlefield conditions, it could seize up after barely 100 rounds. A weapon soldiers learned to fear almost as much as the enemy. America answered with something built by one of the greatest firearms designers who ever lived, John Moses Browning. His Browning automatic rifle fired a powerful, .30 caliber round from a detachable magazine with both semi-automatic and fully automatic settings. It was lighter, far more reliable, and considered such a battlefield secret that commanders deliberately held it back from the front lines, saving it for a decisive push the following year. A push the war ended before it ever needed. Germany, meanwhile, pioneered something else entirely: a compact, rapid-fire weapon built for close combat, arming elite stormtroopers who tore through Allied trenches in shock assaults. It was one of the earliest submachine guns in history, and it hinted at exactly where infantry weapons were headed next. By the war's end, the lesson was carved into every army's doctrine: lighter, faster, more mobile automatic weapons were the future. That lesson would define the next global war just 2 decades later. The First World War wasn't won by generals, grand strategy, or bravery alone. It was decided by a weapon that never got tired, never hesitated, and never stopped, operated by ordinary men who paid for every second of that endurance with their sanity, and far too often, with their lives. Remember that number from the start: 62,000 casualties out of 170,000 men. That's not a statistic. That's the real price of holding that trigger. If this just showed you a side of World War I you never learned in school, that's exactly why the War Files exists. Subscribe right now, ring the bell so you don't miss the next one, and drop a comment telling us which weapon or battle we should expose next. We read every single one.